This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on India-China issue in wake of disengagement in Galwan Valley. The participants are Atul Aneja, strategic analyst, and Simran Sodhi, journalist.
India and China have begun a slight disengagement from the face of sites in the Galwan Valley. We also see that the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval also held talks on the telephone with the Foreign Minister of China, Mr. Wang Yi, and it seems that both India and China are taking steps towards the de-escalation process. Mr. Aneja, when you see what is happening now and there seems to be a willingness even from the Chinese side to de-escalate, do you feel that there is a genuine attempt by China to de-escalate, and how far can India trust the Chinese given their behavior in the Galwan Valley so far?
I think it's a great move that process of disengagement seems to have started. And as you mentioned, this has happened after a conversation between the National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval, and his Chinese counterpart, Mr. Wang Yi. So there seems to be a political understanding behind what we have seen in the Galwan Valley so far. Despite the understanding at a very senior level, the taste of the pudding is in its tasting. So we have to see actually on the ground how are the Chinese going ahead with the disengagement in accordance with the commitments they have made. We need a proper verification regime in place to confirm whether the disengagement has actually taken place in accordance to the distances which I'm sure would have been negotiated, to which the Chinese and the Indian troops would be required to disengage. Even if the Chinese stick to the understanding, I do not think that India should lower its guard at all, because what really has happened in Galwan is a breach of trust, and it will take a long time before the trust can be restored. So I think while we welcome the disengagement, while we hope that it genuinely takes place, but there is no room for lowering our guard. And I think vigilance at the highest level and of the highest quality would be required in the days to come.
Mr. Aneja, if we look at China's behavior and we see the barbaric fashion in which the Chinese army attacked the Indian soldiers, and if we look at the situation more broadly and we take a global look, we also find that China does not find itself in a very comfortable position globally today. We see the bad relations it is having today with the United States. As far as Hong Kong is concerned, the UK has also come out and supported Hong Kong and criticized China. We already see the COVID-19 pandemic and its effect on the Chinese image globally. Do you feel that this aggression by China is somewhere then a very desperate attempt to boost its image somewhere?
I think whoever has taken that decision did not see through in a 360-degree manner, or did not anticipate the reaction at a global level that it would trigger. Now, if you really look at it, what was happening in Ladakh was only part of the story. India was really at the front line with the Chinese. But if you look further to the east, there are 2 U.S. aircraft carriers already entering the South China Sea. On April 2nd, the Chinese had sunk a Vietnamese fishing boat. That is, the Chinese Coast Guard had done that. And so there was a problem, and the Vietnamese had joined, by the way, the Quad Plus mechanism. That is India, US, Japan, Australia, and the plus included New Zealand, Brazil, Israel, and Vietnam. The Quad Plus mechanism in the fight against COVID-19 had already emerged. Vietnam was seamlessly, in a way, entering into the larger security sort of a platform which was emerging. So you find a lot of pressure on China coming in the West Pacific, specifically in the South China Sea. And then you had India, which had shown resolve and had not buckled down. And I think the sacrifice of Colonel Babu and his men and the fight and the resolve they showed on June 15th at Galwan, I think that sent a very strong message to the Chinese that India is not going to blink. Plus, pressure is mounting on the other side. And I also found something very interesting which happened, I think, 2 days ago, when Chinese media started criticizing the Russians on the celebration of 160 years of Vladivostok joining Russia, because that used to be a Chinese territory earlier. So, as I saw as an analyst over here, there was a very complex defense line which was being formed against China. It was sort of starting from the east, if you look at from the West Pacific and South China Sea, and then coming down to Ladakh very strongly. And that was the spearhead of the front line, which is India. And then you found simmerings of that also happening on the Eurasian, on the Russian side. And on top of that, a visit of Defense Minister Rajnath Singh to Moscow and there was this deal of additional number of Sukhoi 30 and MiG-29 aircraft which had been signed, and a conversation between Prime Minister Modi and President Vladimir Putin just a few days ago. So I think China knew that it had made a huge blunder, and the pressure was coming not just in the direction of the South China Sea and the West Pacific, but further towards the Eurasian front as well. I think finally what has really happened is that maybe a realization had dawned that you can't take all the fronts together, and that is why we might see the beginning of this disengagement starting in Galwan Valley. Hopefully it will go to others. But the bigger question which arises is it just merely a tactical withdrawal by China, or has China taken a strategic decision to disengage, which means it should be followed by a much bigger dialogue, probably a border dialogue between India and China. So if it goes in the direction of a broader dialogue among the special representatives in actually resolving the border row, that would be an indication that perhaps there is a strategic change in Chinese thinking. But till that does not happen, it would be fair to assume that this disengagement is purely tactical in nature, and India, as I said, should not lower its guard. We need to keep vigilance, not only us, but people or countries which have shown their own misgivings about China after the COVID-19 pandemic.
Mr. Aneja, as you mentioned, we had the Defense Minister Rajnath Singh visit Moscow. We also had the Prime Minister visit in Ladakh, and he addressed the Jawans there. The Prime Minister did not mention China as such, but it was clear when the Prime Minister said that this is not the age of expansionism and this is the age of development. How strong do you think that is also a message to China and the Chinese leadership that maybe they miscalculated and the India of today is very different and will stand up and push back to any Chinese aggression that it feels?
I think the Prime Minister's visit to Ladakh was a strategic move. And in any kind of a situation of military tension, there is the country which can mount an element of surprise is the one which is at an advantage. I would compare Prime Minister's visit to actually a strike which has caught the Chinese by surprise and unawares. And on top of that, I think his message to the Chinese that the age of expansionism is over is a message which is going across a large part of the globe. I was watching the Australian media yesterday, which have given extensive coverage to the Prime Minister's speech and his message, and specifically the bottom line that the age of expansionism is over and the age of development has dawned. I think his visit was perhaps the final blow which decisively changed the Chinese thinking and probably persuading in the direction of a disengagement. I think it was an exceptionally important move.
Mr. Aneja, we also see that when we look at China today, and we see that whereas China's image globally seems to have dipped, we also see that the world is opening up and accepting India more and more as a global player. We also see that India will be in the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member for 2021-2022, and we are also there in WHO today. Do you feel that the fact that we've often referred to this as the Asian century, but the fact that India's global legitimacy seems to be rising, is that unnerving for China, and would someone interpret that maybe this builds into the Chinese insecurity when it comes to handling with India, and then you see these aggressive behavior, you see these kind of intrusions and expansionist policies?
The rise of India has been recognized for some time by the world. And I think that is something materializes further and becomes more visible. It does, in a way, stoke Chinese insecurity, because frankly, when I study China, I still feel that the Chinese have not moved away from the central concept of their self-image, which is that they are a middle kingdom, which essentially means that China is the center of the world, surrounded by satellites around it, in the form of tributary states. This has been the China's worldview of itself, and since the time of 1000 BC, from the Zhou dynasty. And you find maybe there are blips in between, but essentially the Middle Kingdom formula has not changed. And if you look at what has happened now, and if you come to the 90th Party Congress of the Communist Party of China, you find that President Xi Jinping not only accumulates power, but he makes two very fundamental points in his address. One is that China will be a moderately prosperous society by 2021, and it will be a developed country by 2050, unrivaled by anybody else. To me, that is the re-fulfillment of the Middle Kingdom dream. And if you're going to fulfill Middle Kingdom dream, where you are the brightest star shining and others are only satellites around, then obviously another shining star like India coming up is going to make them feel uncomfortable. And that is precisely what's happening now. I do not see in the Chinese worldview a place of equality for the rise of India. And this is the basic tension at a very philosophical and a theoretical level between India and China. That unless you accept India also as a civilization state which has its geocultural footprint across Southeast Asia up to Vietnam. For example, Vietnam was called Champa earlier. You find Angkor Wat in Cambodia. You find Indian influence, Ramayana in Java and in Indonesia. You can see the Indian cultural footprint all over. Not only do you see it in the form of architecture, but also in terms of trade and commerce, which was there for centuries between India and Southeast Asia, as well as on the West Coast towards the Arab world. So India itself is a civilizational state, and unless China can accept India as a civilizational state of equal status, I think this tension will not be resolved. And the ball is really in China's court as to what self-perception it does have of itself, and whether its mindset is willing to accommodate other civilizations at par and in harmony with itself. I think that is a fundamental challenge which the Chinese will have to grapple.
Mr. Aneja, if we look at the role of the United States in this entire confrontation that has taken place, we also feel that the United States has been quite clear that it supports India in this action. And we have seen that the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has come out. He has welcomed India's ban on certain mobile apps that he said can serve as the appendages of the Communist Party of China. We also know that he spoke to External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar, and there has been information sharing between the United States and India, and more it seems quite apparent that the US stands with India and is critical of the Chinese aggressive behavior. How important do you think it is for India to have the US backing it, and how embarrassing is it for China to have the US on a global platform criticize it for its actions?
India's relationship philosophically and fundamentally on an equal plane with the United States is extremely important. So I think you mentioned about Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. I think you've got to also keep in mind that administrations in the United States change. And right now, I think we have an excellent relationship with the Trump administration. On top of that, we have a great personal chemistry between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. And I think given the Trump administration's dispositions towards China, it is already fighting a trade war, but I think it's gone beyond that and is engaged in a Cold War. And the Trump administration and India being on the same page is exceptionally important. And on the Eurasian flank, we have a great equation with the Russians on the other side. So frankly, India right now is so well positioned that China is really surrounded by a pincer on either side, one from the Eurasian flank, the other from the Indo-Pacific flank. And I think the role of the United States is exceptional. And the very fact, as I mentioned, that there were 2 aircraft carrier task forces in the South China Sea already at a time when Chinese were exercising and probably threatening Vietnam and Philippines, to be there has been a decisive factor in causing or generating the momentum for this possible disengagement which we see. So yes, the US factor right now is utmost importance.
And in the coming days, we will continue our discussions on the India-China relations and the many issues related with it. With this, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on India-China issue in wake of disengagement in Galwan Valley. The participants were Atul Aneja, strategic analyst, and Simran Sodhi, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our website newsonair.com. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsttalks@gmail.com.